Welcome to Getting Ghosted, an intuitive, soul collective podcast. I'm your host, Allie Horner. Welcome back, everybody. I wanted to make a quick note that today's episode is a really special one. It is actually about a little bit of a spiritual scavenger hunt that I went on last week, totally spirit-led. I ended up finding some really cool things and channeling some fun messages from someone very unexpected from the other side here in Denver. And so this episode was originally featured last week on my other podcast called Afterlife Interviews, the women that history tried to erase. All right, here we go. Hello, everyone. We are back with the women that history tried to erase. These are stories and tales of women who wanted to share their afterlife experiences about their lives and the details that may have kind of been left out from the history books. Even though some of these women will be women who are a little bit more well-known at times, there are often details or perspectives that they want to share from their afterlife experience from after death. And that can be really different at times, or add a little bit more context, color or flavor to things rather than just knowing who they were when they were alive. And also, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but a lot of things get left out of the history books and edited heavily. So without further ado, let me tell you about what happened this week. This week, I went on a little spirit hunt. I decided to see what would come through from the other side if I just followed my hunches and my nudges. Now, I do this all the time. I call it like a spiritual scavenger hunt. I have notepads and all fun things like designed to take people on little spiritual adventures, trusting their intuition or listening to spirit and learning how to communicate with spirit-led stuff where basically, what I do is I sit down and I say, okay, what am I feeling today? Who am I feeling trying to come through? And I go through the main identifiers, picking up it's a woman. Here's the time period I'm sensing she's from. Here's the image I'm getting or what she's saying, etc. And I start to piece things together. And so today I was out on my little morning stroll as per usual. And I noticed that over the last week or so, I had a whole bunch of things sort of coming to mind, and they had really strongly started to synchronistically happen in the night before and the day before. And so I realized everything was trying to connect me to someone here in Colorado who wanted to get my attention. This person, I wasn't sure who it was at first. And I was like, you know what, let's just roll with it. So after my walk, I started to pick up more detail, and I felt this really strong, I need to get home, I need to take a shower, and I need to get over to the Denver Botanic Gardens. And so I literally jumped out of the shower, perfect timing. I went over there with wet hair and everything because I was like, I just need to get over to the Botanic Gardens. And they open at 9. I'm a member. It's one of the only memberships I have to anything here in Colorado. But I love the Botanic Gardens. So I went over there with my wet hair, and I brought my whole bag with my notebooks, pens, computer, everything, because I knew exactly where I need to go sit. I could feel the lasso. I could see the image in my mind. And this is what happens when spirit starts coming through. They'll give you a really strong, nudges, pulls, images, guidance will come through really strongly. And I started to hear someone talking right as I began walking from my car into the Botanic Gardens. And, it was literally I heard someone saying, I'm so excited to talk to you. I'm so excited to talk to you. This is going to be fun. I was like, okay, there's definitely a woman here. So I went in, and I was kind of looking, after you walk in, there's a little cafe that you can walk to, or you can just start strolling around the gardens. And it's designed for you to essentially kind of almost go left and go around. But this voice said, no, let's get coffee first. Come on, let's come and have our coffee. Come and sit with me for a minute. And so that is what I did. I ended up grabbing a little green tea and sitting down, pulled out my notebook, and everything started to flood through. Now, I want to share as well, I specifically picked up on 2 different women initially. I could really clearly see that there were 2 different ones, and then a third one came in. Now, the first person who came in was more modern. Her haircut reminded me kind of Diane Keaton, similar length, sort of a similar coloring, like kind of like a light brown, but it had some gray or silver in it as well. Very pretty. And again, like much more modern. I had that like 90s, 2000s kind of feeling off of her almost. And she was just very quiet, kind of sat back a little bit more. It was clear that she loved the gardens. I saw her with like a little gardening hat on and her shears and her gloves. She wasn't as chatty, but she clearly was there, right? Like, so I clearly was like, just aware that she was there. She was kind of just sipping her coffee, sitting back, and she had hers in a little white, like ceramic cup. Now, after that, there was another person who popped in, and this is where it gets really interesting. So this woman came in. It was clear that she was sipping tea. Okay, I saw her sitting at tea, and she was showing me these images from her life, and it was clear that she had some connection to society. Okay, I was aware that she had been relatively wealthy. And I saw a house being built for her, and I saw her being near Cheeseman Park. Like, she was very connected to Cheeseman Park area, and she loved the Botanic Gardens, Then I was kind of, I was just like kind of sitting there sipping my green tea and letting her show me things. And she had referenced the Victorian era, and I went, the Victorian era, and she said, yes, but I lived beyond that. And I kind of went, okay, so maybe she was born in one era and, lived into the next area, or was born right on the cusp between two eras. And that made a lot of sense, because the year I was getting something around the year 1890 showing up in my mind's eye really strongly. Okay. I saw her wearing a hat, a dress. I got like a purplish color in this particular dress. I also saw deep reds, but I saw her wearing different colors at different times, but it was just like this one stood out more. She seemed very stylish. She had gloves. And then I saw a carriage, and I saw her husband wearing some sort of like, it was like a nice tux. So I was aware that they would go to some sort of like either really nice parties or balls or something like that. She also felt very, very connected to the Botanic Gardens. She loved the rose garden area, and she kept saying rose, rose, rose garden. And she said, come stroll with me, come walk with me, and let's take a gander. And I was like, okay. So I went and I walked over to the little rose garden area, and I turned and looked, and there was a bench, which I'll put images of this in the Patreon group as well. And in that bench spot, she was saying, here, come sit. And I noticed that we were really, really close to the porter wearing house, which, if you aren't familiar with that, I'll put some links and pictures in the Patreon group as well. But that house was actually donated by Ruth Porter Waring. And she was one of the founders of the Denver Botanic Gardens. And I'm sure you can, where this is going. That house is famously haunted. Like, people are always like, this house is haunted. I'm not a big fan of the word haunted. I think, spirits liked to visit certain stages, or spaces. They like to make themselves known. There can also be different like residual energy, which isn't a haunting. It's like an imprint. But I remember when I went in there and did a tour, there was a woman. I very clearly saw a woman on the staircase. And I was very aware that there was a spirit there who loved everyone there looking at the house. And so I sat there and I just kind of, listened to her while she was talking. And as I sat on this bench, and she just loved everyone being there. She loved everyone being at the gardens. And so it wasn't super clear, because I don't get a lot of names. It wasn't super clear to me who exactly it was right away. But the more that I paid attention to what I had kept seeing, coming in clairvoyantly and coming in clairaudiently, the more I became aware of, I think this is Ruth Porter Waring. I think this is exactly who this is. And I didn't really know too much about her previously. Like, I vaguely remembered someone saying the name of the house and like, oh, this was donated and now it's used as like admin offices and it's open up for, super like certain little things during the year. But usually you can't go in there. But I'd always had this feeling of there's a woman in this window. There's a woman in this window, and she's gazing out and watching and loves that everyone is looking at the gardens and enjoying the garden. it was clear to me that whoever this person was very connected to the gardens. And again, I kept getting this certain era. I got a lot of connections also to money. I also got a feeling of her being connected somehow potentially even up into Estes Park area, but it wasn't super clear why. Maybe even Aspen or Vale. Those areas were coming up as well. And it would have made a lot of sense because some of these families would have traveled up into the mountains at times. Now, here's what was interesting. When I was sitting there, she started to tell me about her dad. Now, what she said was, my father had worked on the farms, and she said this was something that he had done a long while back. And then he had come to Denver. He had come to Colorado because he was really shown the riches that the West could bring. And there was something for him around some ranching, yes, but mostly around mining and around the railroads in business. And so she had showed me, she said he helped develop a lot of the downtown. He worked on he helped with the railroads. And she was showing me the infrastructure. And I thought, how interesting. She said he began to build downtown Denver where the railway station sits now. And then she said, before he really began his ascent into society, which he did really quickly, and I found this out later when I did a little sleuthing after all these messages came through. She said he was known for mining, and he did some home building as well. And she was showing people being moved around, people being given jobs, hiring people. And she said, I stood by my family and made my place in society. And he was right there, echoing that with her. And she said, but I found my place in the tea rooms and horticultural society. And that's when it really hit it home. And I was like, I think I know who she is. And she said, but there were others who came before me as well. And she told me, this is where I met Molly Brown, which I think is really, really interesting because Molly Brown, I had to look this up because I was like, wait, so these two had some overlap, even though they may have been really different in terms of age or whatever, they may have had some overlap. And I remember hearing and learning that Molly Brown from our Molly Brown episode, that she also lived in Denver and was a socialite and a suffragette, and her husband, I believe, had connections to mining. And I was like, oh, I wonder if these two rubbed elbows a little bit, or had some crossing over, some sort of meeting. And that's something I haven't looked up yet. So I'm going to have to do some sleuthing at our history museum, or see if I can find someone to let me dig into some archives and see if I can find some record of that. And then right around that, why does she said that? Molly Brown, who is a known Titanic survivor, and like I said, suffragette in Colorado, all of that, jumped in and she said, I was an old battle axe if she ever saw one. And I just thought to myself, that is so funny. And then she said, this woman came back in and said, we gave money to charity. And she said it helped people a lot because she said, I really wanted to do charitable work. I really cared about charitable work. And so that was a lot of what she started to pour herself into. And she cared a lot about this charitable giving, but I feel like she wanted to do something else within the society. And she said, I asked her about the Botanic Gardens. I was like, what's your connection to the Botanic Gardens? And she said, well, I stand here proudly. And she said, but the Botanic Gardens was an area I delighted in. But the truth is the park was quite, and she paused and then she said, nauseating. And she said it was a cemetery after all, not a sightseeing trip. And I just went, oh my gosh, because Cheeseman Park, famous Cheeseman Park in Denver, and where the Botanic Gardens is, it's connected to Cheeseman Park. So Cheeseman Park is an old cemetery. And back in the day, there was a man who he was paid to come and remove the bodies because they were like, this is unsightly. There were all these society folk who lived around Cheeseman Park area who were like, we don't want the cemetery here. We want it moved. I think they moved it south from what I understand, but could totally be butchering that. And so they paid someone to come and move the bodies. And the name that had been popping in my head was Mick G, Mick something, McGovern, McGuire. And I looked it up and it was McGovern. I was like, oh my God, that's the guy. And she kept saying, yes, McGovern. Like she was, and I was like, let me Google this just to double check. Sure enough, his name is McGovern. He was paid to move the bodies. And first of all, he didn't do all of them. So there's still like 2,000 to 3,000 bodies estimated under the ground at Cheeseman Park. No shit. Like no joke. And on top of that, what he did was so gross. So basically, because he was getting paid, it was like per body. He just kind of figured, oh, well, what if we just bring in some smaller coffins and he would like chop up bodies and like put a limb in one and a limb in another so that it looked like he was taking out more and more full bodies so that he would get paid more money. So a lot of the coffins that they moved ended up having like one arm in them, or like, I was like, that is so not cool of him. So anyways, and they still couldn't get it all done in time anyways for the park to open. So in essence, they just left a bunch of the bodies there. So Cheeseman Park and the Botanic Gardens famously have a lot of spiritual activity. And so that's what she's referencing as well. And she was like, yes, it was so sad because so many people came here they came here for their resting place, and they didn't really, she was like, of course the spirit, the soul is always at rest, but their poor families, like, I was like, oh gosh, yeah, I know. And so anyhow, it just was it was very interesting because she started to reference that, and she said at the time it was very unsightly, but they did change everything over. Now that happened earlier in her lifetime because she had showed me again like that 1890-ish like time frame, and they really undertook the project to move all the bodies in the early 1890s. So she would have been very young. And so while she loved the Botanic Gardens and she showed she was very much like a prominent person who was connected, who even like was part of founding the Botanic Gardens, all of that, she still was like, oh, the cemetery was so unsightly. Like, and I got this feeling of her like having disgust toward it, but wanting to make it beautiful and wanting to have pride in this area again, wanting it to feel and look beautiful and not be so associated with the cemetery aspect anymore. Now, here is what is super, super interesting. Now, I sat there and I kind of I paid attention to a lot of what she was saying and telling me. And she was talking about her charity, philanthropy, things that she had wanted to give to Colorado, like things that she had wanted to give to children. And I have all my notes right here because I sat down and I was writing. Like she kept like really articulating the way that she felt about things. Like there were so many lovely, wonderful things that we got to have. And then we would see these people who were suffering or struggling. And she was referencing them a lot of charitable giving, a lot of donations, trying to build things, trying to create opportunity for other people. And lo and behold, when I finally went online and I Googled everything to cross-check, like, okay, who is this that's coming through? And I kept getting the letter R over and over and over. It was Ruth Porter Waring, daughter of Henry M. Porter, the Denver pioneer, merchant, and philanthropist. And her father, Henry Porter, came to Denver in 1862 and built a huge fortune. He was actually a liquor dealer and powder company agent, but he ended up diving into mining himself. And he, in fact, previously had worked in farming, which is wild because remember that part. And he ended up expanding into mining and ranching here, branched into banking, and so she had mentioned him building houses. He went into real estate development, and he developed a lot of land in Denver, which I thought was just so cool. Now, Ruth Porter Waring, she had purchased, it's this historic villa right on the Botanic Gardens, which I had mentioned, now is known as the Waring House. And that was in like the 1950s. And then she donated it to the Denver Botanic Gardens in memory of her father. And I just kept thinking, that's it. This is the person when I saw that. And again, that building now has the Denver Botanic Gardens administrative offices, but you can go and tour it during certain like specialty events at certain times a year. And get this, she definitely was involved in horticulture, and she is one of the founders of the Denver Botanic Gardens itself. So it makes a lot of sense why I was drawn there, why I kept picking up on this person, why I kept seeing her, why I felt like she feels like she's very much of this time period and yet like not of this time period. Because her lifetime spanned a lot of changes in culture, in history, a lot of changes in women's rights, a lot of changes overall. And because of who she bumped elbows with, again, I'll have to like do some deeper sleuthing on this, but it's very likely she would have crossed paths with Molly Brown in some way, shape, or form. Now, this is really interesting as well. She was referencing Estes Park at one point. She had talked about the aspens changing colors and the golden leaves and how the air was so much cleaner there, how it felt so much better up in the mountains and up near Estes Park. And I was like, that's really interesting. And she was referencing being up near the Stanley home. Okay, the Stanley, she was calling it like the Stanley house. And then I was like, so she was up in Estes Park. Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. A lot of these families would go up to Estes or Aspen or, spend some time in the mountains and things like that. And what I kept thinking of, what kept popping in my head is like, well, a lot of people were sent up into the clean, fresh air of the mountains when they had tuberculosis, because being down in Denver and down, at lower areas, they used coal and like everything was coal. The air was dirty. Denver it's hard to describe with the mountain range, but it almost has this kind of almost half bowl shape in a sense. So air and pollution can, unless there's certain things going on with the jet stream and it moving certain air in to push pollution out, it can actually get kind of trapped in our atmosphere at times. So we go through time periods where we have like pretty bad air quality. And so that leads to even more like of that, the breathing problems and the lung problems and all of that. And that was because they used, a lot of really nasty like coal and stuff like that. The air was awful during certain time periods in Colorado's history. And so people would come up to the mountains with tuberculosis symptoms. And they would come up to the mountains and it was like prescribed often as like a Hail Mary, like hope this works, last resort type of thing. And get this, when I was researching her after this all came through, it said her husband was a tuberculosis specialist in Denver. And I was like, okay, that's no coincidence. And the Stanley themselves, the Stanley brother who came up and actually built this famous Stanley hotel from like where The Shining was based off of, and the famous like haunted room and the haunted hotel, that was his. Like he had tuberculosis. That's the whole reason he came up to Estes Park, was because he had like a case of tuberculosis, and his doctor like sent him up there as like I have this summer home and you're dying anyways. You may as well go enjoy the fresh air while you're dying. Like it wasn't expected that he would recover. And he ended up like being completely recovering from living up in the clean, fresh air. And then he would invite all of his wealthy friends up. And I just went, oh, this is so interesting that there's so much of this like almost kind of like overlap here. From there on out, a lot of people would gravitate up there to get like cured, if that makes sense. So it's possible that there's definitely some like overlap there with the fresh air and then her husband being a doctor. Now, here's what's super cool. During this, there was someone else that I was feeling. Okay. There was another woman that I kept like getting connections to, and I didn't feel like her connection was as much with the Denver Botanic Gardens. Okay. But I felt like her connection was Cheeseman Park. And I just kept getting, and then also Molly Brown. Like I was like, this is like a weird 6 degrees of separation thing. And I kept going, there's a couple different women here and they're all kind of connected. They were at different ages from each other. Some like, they were alive at the same time. They had some overlap and they probably, rubbed elbows because of that higher societal standing and that access to wealth and money and the gatherings and the parties and all of this type of stuff. Like I'm betting all their husbands did business together. And I kept getting something about the husbands being connected and then Molly Brown being connected. So So get this, because this is super, super cool. So I kept getting this other woman coming in who had referenced like, oh yes, my father was very wealthy. She had said he also was connected to mining because we're out west. So everyone that was big money back then was connected to mining and real estate. They would build, they would get into mining. They were all just the railways, everything. So, and she said also, he also was in ranching and he was in real estate and he was in mining. Okay. And I had gotten something about like silver rush, gold rush, silver rush, gold rush, things like that. And then I also was getting something about her father having, he was the first of his family to come here. So this is another woman, okay? First of his family to come here. And the weird thing is she was also showing me the letter R, and I kept getting something around Rose, Ruth, something like that. Okay. And now we would assume it was the first Ruth, right? But guess not, because she was like, no, my father was different. My father was one of the first in his family to come to Colorado. And she was showing that he had immigrated here. And she said something about like Dutch German connections. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to have to try to find that or look that up because I don't know how much genealogy would be public, but I bet there would be some ability to find some connections. And a lot of times if people, are in one area of Europe, they'll have connections to other areas. Now, this woman, again, had made a lot of references to Cheeseman Park, that she had loved Cheeseman Park. I saw a grand old house on the park, and I was like, oh, I know that house. I know where that is. And she had also, there was clearly a lot of connection to Cheeseman Park as well, and like just love for the area. Now, this woman also, again, kept referencing Molly Brown. And kept saying like Molly Brown and I worked together, and she really cared about children. Like she was like so into children. She was into the arts, I got the feeling of being very well educated. And she was showing me like art and philanthropy and children, just something that like really mattered to her. So much. There was just so much of that in there. Now, this person I had also been picking up in this 1890 time period as well. And I was kind of like, okay, I'll have to keep that in the back of my mind because I never know. Is that the year you were born? Is that a significant year in your life for some other reason? It could be a wedding, a death in the family, a significant turnaround year for them, a year they emigrated, like we don't know yet, right? So I just kind of like put that in my back pocket. Now, as I was sitting in the rose garden, I felt her come through really strongly as well. And she said, what I want to explain is that the very heart of a woman is all, love, warmth, poetry. And she said privacy and like almost like being very, like keeping to oneself in a sense, like not playing showing all of your cards, was very performative in Victorian age. And I went, okay, interesting. And she was referencing a change out of that Victorian age, which I thought was like really interesting. Okay. So I kind of kept an eye on that and I was like, ooh, so there was like a shift here from one age, into this next age, this next time frame. Okay. And she said, women had to have mystique. They had to do charitable work and be pious. And she said, we were not previously she said something about her father maybe not being previously well off. I wasn't like super sure. And she said, there were so many people who couldn't be bothered with children's welfare. And she was referencing like society's children. And she said there were so many, we had no homes for them all. So we gave money only to these welfare organizations run by nuns, or she was like referencing like charitable giving, orphanages, things like that. And she said it just wasn't enough. So we began to go to the men and made pleas for societal change, right? Because these men were really involved. They obviously had their hand in a lot of things in politics too. Like everyone rubbed elbows back then. And she said, like, couldn't anything be done about the children? Couldn't something be done about the children for their welfare? And then she said, something had to be done. Something had to be done. And she said it was just so hard to see people suffering when we were like going to these lavish parties and had too much food, had too much of this and too much of that. Now, I thought this was interesting too. And she said women often and girls were often seen as ornamental, like they didn't have their place in the business of society all the time, right? It took so much for them to get there. They weren't allowed in the bigger discussions where decisions were made in the back rooms. And she's showing men sitting at like gentlemen's clubs with their cigars and stuff, right? Where women weren't allowed to go, or not her, right? Not women of society. Like it was like, that's a men's space. And she said, so women were ornamental, sort of puppets in a sense, didn't have that same value. And she said, but we were very educated and very smart. And she was showing the women whispering, and then kind of tugging at the gentleman's sleeve and, talking to their husbands. Well, isn't there something we can do? Well, wouldn't there be something we should do? It'll help you in business. Like there were ways they had to kind of like go roundabout with it. Like, and that they would kind of help each other in that way. And she's showing them having tea, afternoon tea. And the men thought that they were just gossiping, but that's not what they were doing. She said, here we were, so much to give and yet so little. Now, I got the particular impression also that a lot of this was when she was young, right? So especially when she was young, like the high tea, all of that type of stuff, that feels like that was young and like during her formative years. And then she also said, she was very focused on poetry, moving about like women and girls being shuffled from place to place, having to make an appearance, having to dress up for this, having to go there, going where her parents wanted. And she said, I got to go to London. We went to Europe to visit the area and meet with many people there. And she's showing her father shaking hands and her older brother. And she kept saying the name Claude. Okay, Claude. And I got this distinct feeling of like Claude being a brother and being significant in her life. But she said she got to go to Europe and that it was very shocking to her, and shocking to her family, to in a sense, almost like there may have been some instances in which other people turned up their noses at them, which I thought was really interesting because this was a family with by this time had quite a bit of money in America. But I got the distinct impression of almost like this older money European families did not see it as worthy. That was definitely the vibe I was getting when she was talking intuitively. Something else she said is, my family was given to worry as well at times. We were given laudanum to soothe the nerves. And she said, the nerves needed soothing. The nerves needed soothing, you see. And she said, so we gave our heavy personal burdens to the doctors. We did the bed rest. We had lakeside retreats, mountain escapes, and simpler living. And she said there was a time period where she was taken in by a friend, and she said they had a lovely home in the mountains. She was showing me potentially near Estes Park, Rocky Mountain National Park. She did reference and showed me the Stanley house as well. And I was like, what an interesting crossover here. Because at first I thought this was a different person talking, right? And then I realized like, wait, no. Okay, wait. This is a different person talking. And she said, my mind went clear and sound and my wellness grew. And she said, she'd also referenced that she had come into some money, that her mother and father had passed and she came into some money. And she was saying, I had more than I could give because I had a much larger inheritance. She said, I also now had family to see to, mountains full of beautiful trees, golden aspen groves, streams, miners calling to each other up and down the mountain. And then she was really showing me that she had a lovely life. She didn't mention her children too much, but it was very clear that she had them. Like she showed moments of tenderness and love there. But I got the very strong sixth sense that she didn't want to talk about her children. Now, this is wild because remember, this is a different person from the previous. Here is who I figured out this woman is. Are you guys ready? Her name is also Ruth. Like, I shit you not. Her birth date is 1890. The previous Ruth that I mentioned that was at the Botanic Gardens, 1889. They were almost born in the same year. This Ruth is Ruth Bottcher Humphreys. She is the only daughter of Charles Bottcher, which is one of Colorado's greatest empire builders, very well known in Colorado. So her father, just as she said, built a fortune across mining and ranching and real estate. He actually started in like hardware, made his way through the Leadville Silver Rush and invested in mining properties in a ranch. So he did do some of what she was saying. He also moved into banking. This is just like wild. And he became one of Denver's largest landowners through real estate development. And so again, like she was referencing some of this as well. And there's a lot of overlap between these two women because these early people who came into the West, they would get their hands in everything because there was so much land, there was so much mining to do, there was so much of everything. Okay. And then he indeed, as I did my sleuthing, he was the first of his family to come to Colorado. He emigrated from Germany as a teenager. And he, like, I don't know if he has the Dutch roots, so I'll have to look up that a little bit more, but it wouldn't surprise me just because I don't know if you've ever looked up your ancestry DNA. You find out you have like ties to certain heritages and nations and stuff like that where you're like, oh, my family doesn't even know this. Like, I mean, I literally have Middle Eastern in my roots, which is just like, you know, like we have so much in our roots that we wouldn't have known about if we didn't do that ancestry DNA thing. Okay. Now, she also, remember I kept saying, I feel like this person has a super close connection to Cheeseman Park. She's very attached to the park. I'm seeing this one house. She indeed lived next to Cheeseman Park. They had bought, her and her husband bought the mansion at 1022 Humboldt Street in like 1920. And so the same architects who designed the Cheeseman Bodcher Mansion, now the Colorado Governor's Mansion, for those of you guys who are familiar, designed this house too, and it's in the Humboldt Street Historic District, which is adjacent to Cheeseman Park. You guys will have to check that out. It's such a beautiful area if you ever come to Denver. Really beautiful, old, cool architecture. Now, remember I mentioned this woman was also referencing Molly Brown and being around Molly Brown. This person was part of Molly Brown's social circle. This Ruth Bodicher was. She said, so her and her husband were members of what was known as the Sacred 36. That's like Denver's like elite. And they raised their daughters, Charlene and Ruth Augusta, another Ruth, in that mansion. And so, I mean, it's wild when you think about all of the connections. Like these two women definitely could have met each other through like Molly Brown too, and like bumped elbows or, cause like, if you really think about it, they were born around the same time. They were in the same area. I mean, it couldn't have been that big of a town, right? When you get to that like upper crusty type of thing, they must have been running in the same social circles. No wonder they were coming up together. And she also was connected, like very philanthropically, very well educated. Again, huge supporter of Denver Art Museum, and her own daughter, Ruth Humphrey Brown, went on to become a noted philanthropist. And so, it didn't mention like a direct like Estes Park, you know, connection, but it definitely could be there. Here is another crazy, crazy connection between them that just like solidifies why they were both there. Charles Bodicher partnered with Henry M. Porter, the father of Ruth Porter Waring. So Ruth Bodicher's dad and Henry Porter, which is Ruth Porter Waring's dad, worked together. They founded the 15th Street Investment Company, which became Denver's largest real estate landholder. So both of these women, their dads were literally business partners in real estate. No wonder they were so strongly connected. I mean, I just keep going like, oh my gosh, no wonder they came in together. I don't know if they were besties or anything like that, but they definitely were connected. So very interesting morning for me. Very interesting connections here. I'm curious what you guys are wondering about these two women. Have you gone on any spirit scavenger hunts? Have you kind of ever sat down and said, okay, who on the other side has things to tell me, things to show me, who wants me to come out and explore something I might not have explored? See what comes up for you. Maybe you'll get to go in a fun new direction. I will link up some fun references and things like that if you guys want to read more about this in the show notes. But yeah, for today, I think that is all. Thank you guys so much for listening.